What is up? Today I want to talk about writing some code. Here's just a small snippet of code. If you're like me when I was starting a year ago, this was definitely pretty confusing. I would copy paste something like this from the forums or from Google into my Webflow project and cross my fingers and hope that it worked. But today I'm going to try to demystify just this block of code. We're not going to get too crazy, but yeah, going to try to teach you something that if you're getting started with code, I think would have helped me when I was starting. Anyways, we'll do a quick agenda. I'll start with number one, a demo of what we'll code. We're going to code something. I've got a Webflow project here that grabs some text. In this case, it's year text, 1999, and auto updates it to the current year. So 1999, 2022. Yeah, so that's everything in Webflow that I want to show you. Now I'll show you how to set this whole project up. To set it up, I'm going to just go ahead and delete everything. Let me go in here. Delete this little bit of code. We want to start everything from scratch. Okay. And then go into here and clean up. There's not much in here. All right, let's get started. First thing I'm going to do, just going to grab a div block onto screen, make it full height, flex center, center. We don't care about our layout for this one. We just want some text on the screen. Okay, let's say I built this web page in 1999 and we'll give it 10 RAM just so we can see everything going on here. And so, you might commonly see this in a footer element like copyright 1999, but you want copyright say I built this site in 2022, but then 2023 comes around. Rather than go into the site a year later and update it, I wanted to auto update. So, first thing we'll do is we'll select the element itself. I'm going to customize the class to, we'll call this year text class. The other thing I'm going to do, you don't have to do all these. I'm showing these for demonstration purposes. We're going to give this an ID, year text ID. And I'm also going to add a custom attribute. We'll call this text, or we'll call it data attribute. And we'll call this year text, something like that. Okay. And now you see we have all sorts of ways to select this element when we're on the live page. And I'll show you that. So I just published. And let's go ahead and open that up. On a new project, you can see it says 1999. When I refresh, it doesn't update because we haven't connected the code to this project yet. What I want to show you first is the Chrome inspector. So if we open up the Chrome inspector, I'm just doing that with Option Command I. The other way to do that would be to come up to View here in Chrome, go to Developer, and view the JavaScript console or Developer Tools. This is the hotkey that I used here. Okay, there's a lot of stuff going on this, but I'm going to direct your attention to certain places. So this is all of our HTML right here. When we're adding elements to the navigator, essentially we're building out, HTML here. And you can go ahead and select things. So if I open up this div block and then we see H1, your text class, something you could do, well, I'll show you this in a minute. But what I want to do is, let's say I want to change this text manually. I can say something, I need to select the element first. So I need a way to get it. And there's multiple ways to do that. Now, the way to do it is with document.querySelector and then open close parentheses. And we're going to pass a class name to it. And the class name that we gave in Webflow was year text class. So I'm just going to pass that here, year text class. And you can see Chrome is smart enough to know that we want to select this H1 element. Query selector by default is going to grab the first element with that class name on it. I press enter. Not much happens because we've just executed this code here. Now, if I want to store that in a variable, say let element equal, and then I can go ahead and copy this and paste it. Now it says undefined because we just stored it in this element. But if I start typing element, you can see I've saved it now here in the console. And something I can do is I can say text content, and that gets me this 1999. And something you could do logically is pass it text content equals 2022. And there, we've just dynamically changed this. Now, if we refresh, we're going to lose. I refresh the page, element no longer exists. See, element is not found. So I'd have to do all that again. I'm just pressing the up arrow here. So if I say element equals document.querySelector, Something else is we can select by ID. If I put a pound sign, that means ID. I go back to Webflow. What was our ID? Your text ID. I'll just copy that. Come back here. Your text ID. Enter element. Now I can do all the same things. Text content, and that gets me the year in a string. And if I just search element and then I press dot, this shows me all the essentially the API or the methods or the properties that are available on this what we would call object. So plenty of things here. So first child, you can get the first child. I'm not going to go into all these children if it has multiple children. Blur is when you focus out of it. Just a ton of different things. Um, one thing we could look at is the data set. And the data set is actually going to return this DOM string map object. And you'll notice we set this earlier, right? The year text to the data attribute. I'm just going to not do anything with that, but I'm going to press enter. And the last thing I want to show you is that we can select by that attribute as well. So if I say, well, let's refresh, and then I'll say let element equal document.querySelector year ID. Realizing, see if I can zoom in on this. Hopefully that's better. It's going to be a little bit verbose, but we have data-attr and then year text. The way we select by attribute is we open and close these brackets. So data attr equals open and close quotes, and then put year text. And now what's element? Still the same thing that we had to do here. And you can see the DOM element or the HTML element that we built in Webflow. It has all those things that those selectors that we're expecting, this ID, it has this data attribute, it has this class. Now, I normally like to select by ID or data attribute because class, if you're using Webflow, you know that your class names can change. The class I tend to use to store styles in CSS. This is all CSS styles that we're adding. So in general, I select by ID and data attribute. Trying to think. Let's go back to the agenda. So we've done this. I'm not quite going to set up code sandbox yet. Now, a question that you might be asking is like, how do you know to do all this in the first place? And really, you don't. You have tutorials, but the first thing you notice, the first thing we started looking at was the document. The document is its own object that has, it's all a bunch of properties and methods here too. And I couldn't tell you what half of these do, but I know how to look that up. So if I just search MDN JavaScript, I want the Mozilla developer documentation. So I go here, and you can, their search is really good. If I search document, so you can see document.querySelector is actually the first one that comes up. For this time, I'm going to say document itself, and this will tell me what that document thing actually is. So it's an interface that represents any web page loaded in the browser serves as an entry point into the web page's content, which is the DOM tree. I'm not going to get into what the DOM tree is. It's essentially this, but there's plenty to learn about that. And then it's as you learn about the document, you'll see, this is describing what all of those different properties and methods do. So now if I say document, now let's say I want to find more out about this query selector thing that we've been using. Query selector returns the first element within a document that matches a specified selector or group of selectors. If no matches are found, null is returned. As I've gotten more and more comfortable with Webflow, what I've found is that a lot of the custom code I'm writing is just selecting elements in the DOM, doing something to change it or um, make something happen, and then outputting some new value. So learning how to select these, you can get pretty complex with these. Let's see, I think there was something, if we read locating DOM elements using selectors. This is a great read as you're learning how query selector works, all the different ways to select elements within the DOM. I think that's enough on that. I don't want to spend the whole time in documentation. So let's jump over to Code Sandbox. I'm actually going to go back to the dashboard and I'll start a new project. We're going to say new sandbox static. I'm going to make a new file, call it index.js. Copy and paste this right here. I have a much more in-depth guide on web development environments in Webflow. I'll see if I can post a link to that here. Anyways, the main thing I want is this link right here. I'm going to go to my page that I want to run the code on, which in this case is home. And go to this before the closing body tag. I'm going to open up a script tag and say source equals, open and close quotes, paste that in, and then the file I want is index.js. Close that tag just like that. And now I'm going to need to publish because it's not going to, Webflow's not going to see that unless I publish. And now let's go ahead and we're back here in this upbeat hertz. Let's just say console.log hello. And I'm going to save that. And now when I refresh this, in the console down here, I have hello. So what I have going on, I'm just going to keep zooming in, is that I have a Webflow project that's running a script that I wrote in Code Sandbox. Now, the next logical step, once you've selected something and you've done something to it, you want to automate how that code is run, right? If I could just say um, const element equals document dot query selector, and let's select it by that ID, your text ID. Remember, for that I need the pound symbol. And I'm just gonna shrink this down. Okay, so we got our element, and then remember element dot text content equals 2022. Let's save and refresh. And now we have some working code. That's pretty cool. Let's see. Code Sandbox is set up. Get familiar with, we talked about the document object, how to select DOM elements. We've talked about that. How can we do something once we select something? We talked about that, setting the text content. Now, how do we trigger our code? Not out code, our code. Something you can do is we have in JavaScript and in web development what are called event listeners. So document, I can add an event listener to that. And the event listener that I want to listen for is DOM content loaded. And I could try to explain that, or we could just go to the documentation and see what that's all about. So document DOM content loaded event fires when the initial HTML document has been completely loaded and parsed without waiting for style sheets, images, and subframes to finish. So we want to wait for all the content to load to grab before we grab anything that happens. Another common one to use would be like on click. You could listen to a click event, and maybe I'll get into that in a second. But anyways, let's say document.add event listener on this event called DOM content loaded. And now what this takes is the listener function. So I'm going to put a comma, and don't get confused. This confused me, but I open and close parentheses. I did an equal sign. This is called arrow notation, and then open and close brackets. And in here, I'm going to define a function. And let's say console.log loaded. Fortunately, the DOM has already loaded, so this is actually going to do nothing. But if I just copy and paste this, well, we can see that it's actually on there. Now I have this event listeners tab, DOM content loaded, and I have this handler. So you can see it knows that this function exists when DOM content loaded event fires. But since it's already loaded, let's just come in here. And actually, let's paste this above and save. And it's going to auto format that for us, which is nice. And we'll refresh. And now we're expecting this console log loaded to happen in our console. And there we have loaded. So very nice. Now what we can do is, rather than console log something, let's actually run our code in there. So this just ensures that we have the DOM elements that we need to access. So I saved and run. Exact same thing is happening. Okay, something you may have realized. It says 2022 here. We're just hard coding that. When 2023 rolls around, nothing's going to change. Let me just run back to our agenda here. How do we trigger our code? We'll talk a little bit more about that. Start coding. That's definitely done. Getting the current date. Now, you may not know where to start with this. So when I don't know where to start, one place, if I'm not familiar with the documentation or I can't find it in the documentation, then I'll go to Google. And let's say how to get current date JavaScript. Or let's say get current year JavaScript. Get the current year in JavaScript, Stack Overflow. Okay, click there. How do I get current year in JavaScript? Create a new date object and call get full year. Returns the current year. So let's see. And look, he's even doing a sample usage right here. This is essentially what we're going to do. But I'm just going to copy and paste this line of code. And I'm going to come and in my console down here, I will paste that. And the Chrome inspector already knows that it's going to be 2022. So we'll just paste that there. And so what I can do is I can come back here and I'm going to declare a variable. We'll say const year equals paste new date dot get full year. And then rather than passing this string here, we'll say year. Save that. Refresh 1999. Updates to 2022. Now, something we're not seeing but good to know is data types in JavaScript. A lot of times when you're starting out in coding and taking these tutorials, the first thing they're going to teach you are data types. And so, something I want you to inspect is we can learn what data type the year returns. So, if I say new date.get full year, I see 2022 there, but notice it's not wrapped in quotes. So, it's returning a number, and I can verify this by saying type of and space. And JavaScript will tell me what type of data that is. The other thing I want to look at is the type of this text content, element.text content. So let's go ahead and copy paste this element.text content. And so we saw that's 2022, but it's in quotes. So type of space, and that's a string. And you can run into a lot of issues when you're trying to push numbers and strings together. So something we should do is we should cast this date to a string. And the way we can do that is just say, let's go to new date.getFullYear.toString, and now it's going to be as a string. And you could verify this if you go into the documentation and just search number data type. Number constructor contains constants and methods for working with numbers. And down here in the available methods, you see we have toString. Turns a method a string representing the specific number object. So back in our code, we know how to get a string now. So we'll go here and say dot to string. And now we can feel a little bit better knowing that we're updating with a string and not a number. If you really see the problems when you start adding things together. The last thing I guess I'll talk about is rather than DOM content loaded, a very common event listener that you want to add is a click element. So we can say click here rather than DOM content loaded. And these would be if we go to, let's just go to add event listener. And I would explore here to see what kind of events you can listen to. The other option to know is like what we were looking at earlier, all these event listeners. So there's this click event listener. However, we don't want to run that on the document. Let's say we just want to run that on the element. So when you click that text, it updates the year. So the first thing before I even run this, I actually need to, so let's change this back to DOM content loaded. And we're inside the function. And then I will say, we want to get the element here, which we're already doing. So let's say, now we can say element dot add event listener. And for this time, we'll want to listen for a click, comma, and now we're going to run a function. So again, open close parentheses, arrow, open close brackets. And inside of this one, we'll run this code. And I think that's should be good. So let's go ahead and refresh. So nothing's happened, which is good. That's what we expect. But you see on this click, we have an event listener here. So let's click it, and boom, it updates to 2022. So what you might do is like use a query selector to get your button and do that, out here, and then on the button click, you would update something else somewhere else on the page. I tend to just see that example over and over again in web development. Let's head back to the agenda. This is all done. We talked about getting the current date. What is it actually? We talked about string versus number. And I would say we tied it all together. Now, things that tripped me up when I was learning is that JavaScript is a pretty old language and has been in development and upgrading for a long, long time. So something you might see is rather than run this function like this and declare the function right here within our event listener, let's just go ahead and trying to think how I want to display this example. So we'll just call this 1. And now I'm going to say declare a function 1 looks like this. console.log 1. So now what I'm doing is instead of defining that function within this other one, I am just passing a reference to it like so. So we'll save that and we'll refresh here and see what happens. And now I get printed out into console 1. The other way you could see this is functions defined within variables. So let 2 equal function, and we're just going to do pretty much the same thing, but we're going to console log and say 2. Now, the DOM content loaded is still getting 1, so we need to pass a reference to 2. So we'll save that and refresh. But we have an uncaught reference error, cannot access 2 before initialization. So it hasn't been initialized yet. And the way to get around this is that we have to um, define the function again in here, and then just invoke it with these 2 parentheses. And we could wrap within curly braces as well. You don't have to, it's on the same line, but if you do, I always just do so I don't forget or run into that error. So now if we run the code, you see we get 2. And the last thing, again, let 3 equal a function. This is just another syntax of defining it. We're going to do the open close parentheses, the arrow, open and close brackets, console.log 3. And we're going to do the same with this one, 3. Come back to our website, refresh, and now we get 3. So in the forums, you'll see all 3 of these styles, and this is something that tripped me up a lot as I was learning. So learning how callback functions with this would be called a callback function. There's all sorts of tutorials like this on YouTube. So getting comfortable with those will really help you get more comfortable coding in Webflow. That's that one. The last thing I want to talk about is jQuery. Okay, I guess there's like a long story past to this one. I honestly haven't been coding long enough to know what it all is, but it seems like JavaScript did not used to be as robust as developers wanted, so they made this library called jQuery, which essentially was a wrapper around JavaScript. It would, do a lot of things that JavaScript would do for you, but provide more help along the way. Anyways, so this is jQuery. There's API documentation. A lot of Webflow guys on Webflow have jQuery builders, and you see it all over the forums. The main thing to look out for to know that you're working with jQuery is this dollar sign. People use it all over the place, and that's because the jQuery selector is just a dollar sign. So rather than having to write document dot query selector, you can just use a dollar sign, and I'll show you. If we just do a dollar sign, open and close parentheses, open and close quotes, and now let's select by our ID again. So I'm going to paste that in there. And you can see we get this thing, but it's different than our document. Well, I won't show it to you this way. Let's say let dollar sign element. You don't have to put that dollar sign there, but this denotes that it's a jQuery object equals, and I'll just copy and paste this. And now if I say dollar sign element dot, see there's no text content. Now it's called text, and it's actually a function. So I have to open and close, and I get nothing. And why am I getting nothing? Not quite sure, but I'm going to, oh, did I not select by ID? Yep, so this needs a hashtag for it, dollar sign element dot text. Now we get that 1999. So it's just different, right? We don't have text content available to us now. It's dot text. So you're essentially learning a whole nother API when you're dealing with jQuery. And in my personal experience, I've been using JavaScript a lot more just because the main reason people complain is if we go to the sources tab, we're going to see that jQuery is loaded up with any Webflow project that you might have. So I'm just going to zoom out a little bit here so we have some more room to work with. And I'm going to click these to format the code. So this is all of your code that Webflow pushes. You can even see our little script tag that we wrote right down there. We have MetaMask and Phantom. These are extensions that I have, so don't worry about those. Assets from Webflow. So you can see Webflow is loading its CSS. This is like default Webflow CSS. Some JavaScript as well. Click these. You can see This is Webflow code that Webflow writes and ships with their um, with all of their sites. Image, we've got the favicon here. If I come into this one, you can see jQuery. We're pulling jQuery, and Webflow does that. Normally, if you were just coding HTML and JavaScript and CSS from scratch, you'd have to tell your project to import jQuery. But in this case, Webflow does it all automatically. And so that's why we have access to this dollar sign. Um, and jQuery is honestly all over the web. So there's a pretty high chance that it might be cached on your user's machine anyways. What people complain about is if I come to this network tab, let's refresh, and you can see it's loading jQuery here with this network request. So it's a 30 kilobyte file that's being added. And the other thing, Webflow, so Webflow has their own JavaScript that they load up to, and then there's also this in page that they load with all of their sites, which is what's used to do the smooth scroll linking. Anyways, so just in general, I try to stay away from jQuery. You can do anything in JavaScript now, and it's pretty robust that is possible in jQuery too. But just want you to be aware that if you're in the forums and you're copy pasting code and you're doing something like, let's go ahead and comment this all out. And we're selecting, well, let's select the document. And rather than add event listener, jQuery has on to trigger event listeners. And you can do DOM content loaded. Same thing. This gets a function now. Console.log hello jQuery. Let's save that. Refresh here. And now we get hello jQuery. So just different syntax, but it's coming from a different library. So something good to know. And I think that's really all that I want to touch on. Just be careful not to mix and match your jQuery objects with your JavaScript objects, is what I'll say. So, a year of coding. I hope this helps. I really wish I had this when I was starting specifically with Webflow. Um, and we learned how to build something really simple. But if you can get through this, then you'll start becoming a lot more comfortable with code, at which point you could start implementing some cool animation libraries like GSAP or 3JS with a lot less trouble. You can copy and paste code from forums for little things you need to happen. Like, hey, if I click here, my client wants something else to happen on the page. So just little things like that. Anyways, thanks again and talk to you soon.